Welcome back to In the Moment. I'm Lori Walsh. Poet Sara Henning is author of the poetry collections A Sweeter Water and View from True North. She's a visiting assistant professor of English and creative writing at Stephen F. Austin State University. As a poet, she's known for her mastery and elegance. View from True North explores themes of identity and family secrets, tenderness and rage, freedom and form. And she's joining us now inside the Kirby Family Studio and SDPP Sioux Falls Studio. Sara, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So we first ran into each other at the South Dakota Festival of Books, and you don't live in South Dakota now, but tell us some of the connections that you have here.
Oh, absolutely. So I actually did my doctoral degree at the University of South Dakota. I studied with our previous poet laureate, Leanne Rohrpaugh, and while I was there, I met my husband, whose family is from Del Rapids. Yeah. And so in many ways, we continue to come back and have spent a good bit of time up here. And so I felt that being in South Dakota has really sort of changed the way that I think about space, the way that I think about my writing. And so it's a very special place.
That's how we get you, by the way. We just connect you with some some individual who makes that connection and keeps you coming back.
Yeah.
Before we talk about View from True North, for people who are approaching a new collection of poetry, who are meeting a new poet for the first time on the page, how do you begin with because so many people, sort of are drawn to some accessible poets, a Ted Kooser or a Mary Oliver. Sure. And then there's another level of intricacy in poetry that this collection really reflects, I think, of craft. How do you begin kind of entering this new poetry space when a new collection comes across your desk?
That's a great question. I tell this to my students all the time, trying to approach poetry on its terms, I think starts with questioning what your assumptions are about poetry. And so if you get caught up in the language or the intricacy, those can be blocking, they can block the way that we might look past that toward content. I think a book like View from True North, which was very difficult to write because it discusses family legacies of abuse, of loss, of sickness, nonetheless, I think reveal very human, very common stories. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people have lived and struggled with alcoholism, domestic abuse, closeting one's sexual identity. And these are things that I think poetry has been taking on more in sort of investigative measures that I think really can help us. And so I think questioning your assumptions and then not being afraid to look at what the book is really trying to do.
Right. So take that back in time a little bit and talk to me about a poet like Emily Dickinson versus where you stand at this particular point in history. You have an opportunity that she does not really have, in the sense that poets have been pushing forward this notion of truth. And you're a fan of Emily Dickinson, right? I think I've read. Yeah. I think so. When you read her work, is she doing the same thing, only in a different time?
I think Emily Dickinson. I sometimes I think about what her life would look like if she were able to have been alive and writing in post-Civil War, sort of post-civil rights kind of America, where women didn't have to be tied down to home, family, tradition, husbands, that sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, I think we are all products of our culture and of our cultural moment. And I think she was a poet who really wasn't afraid to speak her truth, but within, I think, the boundaries of thinking, no one's ever really going to read this, right? Her poems are very much almost this this confession on the page of her feelings about so many sort of different things that make up our reality. I love Emily. I think sometimes my poetry may align itself a little bit more to Walt Whitman, right? Which is
Right.
this very identitarian sort of way of trying to sort of engage the body, engage the celebration of the body, the celebration of the self. Actually, a recent review of A View from True North, the wonderful Chelsea Wagner just published today, and she reminded me of this wonderful statement that Walt wrote in the preface to Leaves of Grass. And just so that I make sure I quote it correctly, the poet judges not as a judge judges, but as the sun falling around a helpless thing.
Mm.
And so I think that matter of perception, I think Emily and Walt both took those kinds of risks of perception.
Right.
And I think we see a lot of that happening now.
Let's talk about View from True North. And you said it's a difficult, it was a difficult book to write because it deals with these other people in your lives and the history of family secrets, abuse, closeting, all kinds of things are in this collection. How did you get to the point, and Leanne Roropar, you mentioned, has done similar work in her poetry dealing with her family and some difficult topics. How do you sort of prepare yourself to say, I am going to now go here and I'm going to be honest, and this is why I'm going to do this? What's your why for going there in this collection?
That's an excellent, and I think it's an essential question for anyone who's going to write very autobiographical or autoethnographic poetry is the why. And I think not asking yourself that can put you in the position of saying, am I trying to get a hot story, right? Am I trying to create this sort of voyeuristic relationship between reader? And that's not at all, I think, what the goal is. I think in many ways, writing about hard family truths, unless we can name our legacies, we can't shift them. We can't change them. We can't re-territorialize our existence and aim for a better way of being, and unless we can truly understand where we came from.
Does craft help transform this from anything that could be voyeuristic? I mean, how much of this, because there could be you might write a poem in a journal and it might stay there and it really might not have any form or structure, but it helped with a healing process. This is a very different thing. There's form here. There's a lot happening from a structure and craft perspective. Does that help the poet and the reader and the story?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does because and I go back to something that the wonderful poet Patricia Smith has talked about. She wrote a wonderful collection called Blood Dazzler about Hurricane Katrina and a lot of the travesties going down in Louisiana. And I think sometimes having a vessel, right, having a shape, some sort of very established sense of this is a material object I'm creating, right? It kind of goes back to creative nonfiction. I teach a lot of creative nonfiction. The raw material you bring, the river teeth, that you bring in, those are wonderful, but what you do with them, right, is what it separates this idea of sort of therapeutic writing from trying to take that writing in and do something with it, something that could help other people. One big motivation for me was I was thinking, I'm not the only person to come from a domestically abusive family, a family plagued by some of these things. And if I can talk about those things, perhaps someone who might not feel like they could talk about those things would read a book like this and say, oh, this is a community. This isn't my own sort of personal isolation.
Yeah, I am not alone. Let's talk about your grandfather, because this is one of the people who inhabit this collection. He's a very complicated person, and you really don't know how complicated he is until his life is over. What did you know about him, your interactions with him growing up?
Yeah. He was in many ways my father. My father died in a fire when I was very little. He was a fireman. And so my mother, after my father died, moved back closer to her parents. This was the 1980s. My mother was struggling financially with her children. And so going back into my grandparents' home, I wasn't privy to a lot of the things that went on when my mother was little. I didn't know about a lot of the very violent abuse. That wasn't something they shared with me. I saw his alcoholism. I mean, I remember he was retired professor, but he would drink, start drinking pretty early in the day, and he was, one of those drunks that was fun until he began to shift. And so I remember deeply loving him, but also deeply fearing him. And so I think when I was able to discover that after he died and we were cleaning out his belongings, my mother asked me for some help, and we discovered this other side of him. And I think it's very easy for people that we love, who we feel like maybe betrayed us in certain ways. My mother eventually told me about the domestic abuse and those sorts of things, to sort of villainize people and say, oh, well, how could someone I love do that? They're terrible. I shouldn't love them. I shouldn't have, these feelings. I think it's so easy to villainize people. But I think the best way to treat people that we sometimes don't understand is to sort of approach it with that lens of empathy. Yeah. And, my grandfather was clearly somebody who could not express himself. He was living in a culture where he grew up in church. He was expected to marry early. He was in the wars. Being gay during that time, yeah. I mean, was dangerous.
You find out after he's gone that he had many male sexual partners.
Yes.
And that was never revealed during his lifetime.
No.
To the people, to you and to his wife and to your mother at least.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much in this book, I want to make sure that we hear your voice reading a poem. What would you like to read from View from True North for us?
Let's see. I think that I'd love to read. Trying to think here what might work. I guess I could read a poem that sort of narratively sort of situates us a little bit in sort of what's going on, and it's one that comes out sort of early in the collection. I love reading from this book, especially now since our wonderful editor at the Crab Orchard series, John Tribble, has passed away. I feel like every time I read from the book, it's commemorating and memorializing his life. So. Rites of Passage, a conditional. Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, 1966. If my mother slips into a canopy of leaves to watch apples, their slurred geographies of bruise and inflorescence pelt the soil below her. If it's the hour when Dean Martin gushes through living room windows, when curtains exhale with his voice's smoky pulse. If the big brass hour pendulums between fixity and ground zero, you're nobody till somebody loves you. If her father's voice fuses into the lilt, fourth martini, you're nobody till somebody cares. If she rips her brother from fantasy raids, his G.I. Joe's febrile with hands or heat, if, sister on her hip, they sprint through familiar incarnations of breaking glass, listening for their mother's sharp exhale as her body hits the wall. If they hush their way upstairs into closets, haunt the metal undersides of beds. If cotton and leather swathe their bodies, if they remember their coordinates, silk pressed to their faces, always a different location, a game of memory. If bedroom crawl space, then bathroom cabinet, wherever their bodies, contorted into shapes of fear and corduroy, can slink. If she tells them, breathe lightly. If she says, gather your breath into a small orb of light and hold it in your chest. If children still as lamps silhouette themselves with curtains, know they've entered a game of waiting. Hold it there. Try not to let go. If the needle grafts the record's face, if her mother's voice hazards a smoke siege saxophone solo, if the same fluid morning, sensual with chill, still wound the air, or if dead leaves curl like burning ends of cigarette paper, leave them. If shouts, metallic and lean, as the rake-shaped marks on a child's legs, still linger. If a hurt turns luscious and stark as a sun muscled open, if the family cat zigzags down memories now instead of hallways, will she remember his moans? If years later a mother still steels herself with brandy and reruns of Lawrence Welk, will her daughter forgive her? If half-washed dishes still glide in a royal of suds, if cocktail glasses fill the kitchen with their glistening, will they blaze through the float of jazz? Tell me, if they burn themselves luminous, the dishes, the daughter, the years forsaking them, will they form a halo big as the moon?
That's poet Sara Henning reading a poem from her book, View from True North, and that's available now. I'm wondering now that the collection is in the world, two things. One, how have people responded to it? And two, how do you move on from this difficult work? So first, you have hopes when you publish something. What has the response been? Critically, it's been outstanding.
Yeah.
From readers who might attend a reading and ask for you to sign their copy, what are some of the things you're hearing from them?
They are largely coming up and thanking me for going there, for writing about material that maybe they've experienced. I can't tell you how many people come up after readings and say, my mother had a problem with alcohol, or my brother was very abusive to us, or thank you for speaking about things that maybe make me feel less shame.
Right.
Really, I think it's about that guilt and shame and sense of isolation. So really, I found that people have been thankful that
Right.
I've been willing to share the story.
Yeah. And for you, putting a close, at some point you have to send it to the publisher.
Yeah.
At some point, the editor, as you mentioned, does their crafting as well, and you hold this period of time in your hands.
Yeah.
And then what?
And then just like growing up in a house that maybe people didn't love you the way that they should have, or they had their own traumas to contend with, you learn how to pick yourself up and move on.
It's a beautiful collection, and maybe one that can only be told through poetry. In some ways, you could make that argument. Certainly in the hands of a poet such as yourself, it becomes more than the material and becomes something for the world as well, and a piece of art. Sara Henning, if you love her poetry, you can tune in tomorrow to our program, because Patrick Hicks with Poetry from Studio 47 is going to feature more of her story and her work. You can also find that at ps47.org. And tomorrow on In the Moment, we also have Congressman Dusty Johnson with us for the day. We're going to talk about the impeachment hearings and also about the price of pharmaceuticals and the Afghanistan paper. So much for tomorrow's In the Moment with Congressman Dusty Johnson. Sara Henning, Happy New Year, and here you are in South Dakota. What are some of the fun things that you just love about coming to this part of your home?
I love Falls Park in the winter. I think it's beautiful. I love driving down streets that are wider to accommodate the snow. I love seeing my husband's family and just how happy and so proud of where they are. They grew up in Dells. Two brothers still live there. Everyone kind of lives in the Sioux Falls area because they just love South Dakota. and it's a special place to be, and it was a special place to ring in the new year.
Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate this collection and your time.
Thank you so much.